So I'd just like to say, bore da a croeso cynnes i'r webinar Forum Seilwaithwyr Cymru. Good morning and a very warm welcome to the Wales Green Infrastructure Forum webinar. Now, when I was a kid, I thought that all the street drains ended up going through the sewage works, so anything that went down there that'd get treated and it'd be fine. 30 years ago, I came across the Yellow Fish campaign. I don't know if anybody else has come across that, but by the gratings in the street, the drain gratings, there'd be a yellow fish stenciled on there to remind people that actually stuff didn't go through the sewage works. I didn't really think a vast amount more about that until I was looking into how we could retrofit SUD, sustainable drainage systems. And I spoke to Ian Titherington from Cardiff, who's their SUDS officer, and he said, you have to speak to Joe Bradley from Stormwater Shepherds. So I said, okay, never heard of Joe or Stormwater Shepherds, but if Ian recommends her, then it must be worth having a chat. And I learned more in an hour's conversation with Joe than I had done in the previous 30 years. And I thought, I have to get Joe to pass on her knowledge to the Wales Green Infrastructure Forum. And so here we are. Before I hand over to Joe, just a bit about how this webinar is going to work for those that haven't been to them before. Joe will speak for about 20 minutes, and then while that's happening, I'll ask you all to remain on mute and to mute your video so we don't get any interference. While Joe's speaking, please put your questions in the chat. And if you have any problems with the webinar, then please note those in the chat. I'll keep monitoring that while Joe's speaking, and I'll do my best to solve any problems that come up. When Joe finishes speaking, we'll go into a discussion. And then what I'll do is I'll ask each person who's put a question in the chat to unmute themselves and to ask that question. Now that's bound to spark off yet more questions. So then what I'll ask you, if you haven't put a question in the chat, use Zoom's virtual hand raising facility, and I'll get round to everybody so you can ask Joe your question. If we get cut off at any point during the webinar, then please just end Zoom, quit Zoom, restart Zoom, and use the link that you've used to get on now to come back into the meeting. And what we'll do after 40 minutes, when Zoom's about to cut us off, is if the discussion's going well, I'll ask everybody to come out of Zoom and use the link to rejoin so that we can get up until 11 o'clock to continue our discussion with Joe. And it's at that point that I'm going to release her and let her get on to saving the freshwater resources of the United Kingdom. So unless anybody's got any questions about how the webinar is going to work, then what I'll do is I'll hand over to Joe Bradley, the UK Director of Operations for Stormwater Shepherds, to enlighten us more about road runoff and what we can do to prevent it. Joe, over to you.
Thanks, Pete, and thanks for that introduction. I will, unfortunately, Pete, you'll have to allow me to share my screen. It says I can't at the moment. So if you can just make me host while I tell you a little bit about Stormwater Shepherds. So Stormwater Shepherds is a fairly new charity in the UK, and we're dedicated to reducing urban pollution and particularly plastic pollution. So most of my work is around road runoff, and some of my work is around gross plastic pollution. So doing litter picks and talking to local authorities about the opportunities to keep litter out of rivers and streams. If somebody can just confirm that you can see my slide, that would be useful.
Yep, we can see it.
Excellent, thank you very much. So that's just a little introduction to Stormwater Shepherds, and you're welcome to have a look at, follow me on LinkedIn if you're interested in learning a little more. That's the best place to go. So what we're going to talk about today is the problem with road runoff and the pollution it causes. I'll mention the first flush principle because I think that's quite important for people to understand. We'll talk about what effects this pollution has, and I will try and keep it cheerful and talk about solutions rather than just problems. This was an interesting article that came out about a year ago, where there is certainly evidence to show that our freshwater fish populations are in decline. And there's a lot of head scratching about this. There's a lot of work being done to improve water quality and water habitats, and yet fish populations are still falling. Yolanda, could you mute yourself? There's a little bit of interference. So anyway, one of the pieces of research that came out at pretty much the same time as that article came from the west coast of America, where they were investigating the death of coho salmon. They have a particular problem with the coho salmon dying as they migrate back up the rivers for spawning, and they were carrying out research to find out why that was happening. And they discovered, after a great deal of research, a particular chemical that leaches out of tire wear particles. So I'll talk a little bit more about tire wear particles in a moment, but coming out of those tire wear particles is a chemical called 6-ppd quinone, which they identified as causing mortality in coho salmon. And just literally in the last 10 days, some more research has been published to show that that chemical also causes mortality in 2 species of trout. So originally, there was a bit of a shoulder shrugging going on in the UK, going, well, we don't have coho salmon, but I can assure you that we do have trout. And so this particular pollution from tire wear particles is something that we need to focus on. So how does it all get into our rivers and streams is the burning question. So this photograph is what they call concrete slip-form drainage channel. It's quite new. It was built when they did the smart motorway programme on the M6 in Cheshire. As you can see, it's a channel designed to take the water off the carriageway as quickly as possible and whoosh it into the nearest river or stream. And this was after some heavy use. You can see that we were in pretty intense congestion because the smart motorway programme was still underway. And so that contamination in that channel is the contamination off the motorway surface, and it's just sitting there waiting to be washed into the river and stream next time it rains. And this particular stretch of the M6 has no treatment on the outfalls. So that pollution is going straight into the local river and stream. This is what it looks like at the other end of the pipe, although this is a different stretch of the motorway. This is the M62 in Yorkshire, and legally, any of you who are familiar with the old Water Resources Act and the previous legislation, that is strictly a watercourse. So in law, that is a watercourse and it should sustain aquatic life. But that little watercourse carries mostly motorway runoff from the M62, and it's grossly polluted and it does not sustain aquatic life. So strictly that discharge is illegal, but for all sorts of reasons, there is no enforcement action taken against highway authorities, and there is no control on that discharge. There's no treatment. Just goes straight into that little stream. We were actually on site looking at the opportunities to retrofit some treatment, and that was 10 years ago probably, and there's still nothing happened. So what's in it? Why do I care? Why do I lie awake at night worrying about this topic? Well, a lot of suspended solids is one of the answers. There's a lot of suspended solids in there. That's why it's black, because a lot of the suspended solids are associated with tire wear particles, so they give it that black discoloration. There are nutrients and organic matter in there, particulate metals, dissolved metals, polyaromatic hydrocarbons, which I'll talk about more, free-phase hydrocarbons, which are the floating oils on the surface that you can sometimes see, and then microplastic tire wear particles. For treatment purposes, we separate those into suspended solids and dissolved pollutants, and I'll just describe them in a little bit more detail using that separation. So the suspended solids are relatively easy to remove, purely because they like to rest and they like to settle out. So this is an outfall in Manchester, and this has no treatment on it. That is simply the outfall structure going into a stream. But you can see the sediment has settled out there, and indeed that black sludge is about 6 to 8 inches deep. And it's settled there just because the water has the opportunity to rest. So if you give this road runoff the opportunity to rest, the sediment will settle out, or a vast proportion of it, probably 50% at least. And in that sediment, you are capturing quite a lot of the tire wear particles and the particulate metals and the polyaromatic hydrocarbons and a lot of the organic matter. So if you can just take out a significant proportion of the sediments, you've done a great job. It's not everything, but it's certainly a huge step in the right direction. The soluble pollutants are a different kettle of fish. So this is a photograph of 3 bottles from a sample I took of a road in Preston in Lancashire. It's just an arterial road into Preston city centre, about 35,000 a day. The bottle on the left is just the raw sample. The bottom in the middle is simply a subsample of that. The bottle on the right has been filtered through a 45 micron filter.
5253.
Sorry, Gail, you mute.
2, 3,
so
4,
that bottle
1,
on the right has been
0, 1,
filtered.
0,
And
6.
so the chap I was with from Lancashire County Council was quite excited because he thought we'd fixed the pollution by filtering the water. But then we did some analysis. And if you look at the right-hand column of the analysis,
1st of August,
numbers in
1982.
red, you can see that there were still significant levels of dissolved copper and zinc in that discharge, even after we'd filtered it. So it isn't enough to simply
916.
make the runoff clean, visually clean, but you must also consider the dissolved pollutants.
Yes.
So the dissolved pollutants are a significant problem, particularly for busy urban roads. And we just need to remember that when we're talking about designing treatment systems. The other thing to remember is and I don't know if anybody on the call is actually a designer, but this is just something I always put into presentations because it's important, is don't fall into the first flush trap. So when we're designing drainage systems, all across the board, drainage systems for homes and roads and factories and things, we try and treat the first flush. So we consider the first 15 minutes of rainfall, and we say it was all right because all the pollution will wash off in the first 15 minutes of rainfall. So if we treat that, we will protect the environment. These are 2 samples I took from that road I've just shown you in Preston on the 9th and 11th of March a few years ago. Both samples are still causing gross pollution. You don't need to worry about the numbers. You just need to trust me when I say both samples are still causing gross pollution, illegal levels of pollution because they are in excess of the environmental quality standard, and toxic levels of pollution. But what's important is this bit. It had already been raining for an hour before we got there. So that pollution level is toxic, it's polluting, it's illegal, but it's an hour after it started raining. So for road runoff, you must always remember that your design must consider a longer period of rainfall. You must treat a longer period of rainfall. And it's worth remembering that because it's a very specific problem with road runoff. It's to do particularly with the, excuse me, with the length of road that you're treating. So the runoff might be traveling 3/4 of a mile before it gets to the outfall, so it takes a while to get there. But also the pollution is continually generated. So when it's raining, you still have cars on the road, and so the pollution is still being generated. So it's just a heads up to remember that. And this is what it looks like. This is the stuff that we catch. So this is the sediment out of a Vortex grit separator that we emptied, and this is whilst it's been treated. But you can see that it's this thick black sludge. So this is what your treatment devices that capture sediment will take out of the river. This one device had been in operation for about 2 years, and it had 5 tons of sludge in it. So that's one device. We think there are 1 million outfalls across the UK that carry road runoff into the water environment, approximately. And this is one outfall, and that's in 2 years, it's captured 5 tons of that sediment. Now, if that had gone into the river, it would have caused gross pollution. And on this occasion, we were lucky to capture it. So there's lots of pollution in there. I've talked about the suspended solids and I've talked about the dissolved pollution. Remember with road runoff, it's not immediately toxic. You don't get dead fish floating down the river. You don't actually get a dead river downstream. If you go in and look, you'll find insects in there. The thing to remember is it's this nasty, insidious, sublethal effect that it's having on the river ecosystem. So it's affecting the fungi and the sediment, it's affecting the microorganisms, it's affecting the invertebrates, it's affecting the fish, it's affecting the things that eat the invertebrates and the fish. So it's just causing a failure to reproduce, it's causing a failure to thrive, it's causing deformities in species. So it's not killing things. So if you go in and do an insect count, you might get a reasonable result. But actually those species will be smaller than they should be and slightly deformed, and the numbers will be lower than they should be. And I think that's probably the reason why this problem has been overlooked for so long. The other thing to remember is groundwater protection, and I've just got one slide on this as a sort of a flash reminder, because it's important, but only in certain places. It's only important where the groundwater is vulnerable. But remember that if you're using infiltration treatment devices like swales, which is what this is, you must remember that those pollutants go into the soil horizons, and most of them will be broken down or captured in the soil horizons, but over time some of them will pass down into the groundwater. So swales are not appropriate for very, very busy trunk roads and junctions, motorways, or where the groundwater is vulnerable. And it's just a reminder really to remember groundwater protection, because many designers will work in areas of the UK where groundwater isn't at risk. There's 15 metres of boulder clay under the site, so they don't need to worry about groundwater. But if you move on to chalk horizons or limestone horizons, then you do really need to start to think about it. But let's talk about solutions. Let's not all be doomy and gloomy. Let's consider what we can do about this. There are lots of solutions. There are sediment traps. So we talked about sediment. We said how important it was to get some of the sediment out. And I said how easy it is to get sediment out, because you just have to allow the water to rest. So this is a sediment trap in Exeter. It's huge. It was built by National Highways. It takes the runoff from, I think, the A38, and it's a roundabout, so it's a busy, busy junction. This was during construction. This was post-construction. So this device is designed specifically to settle out the sediment, where they can easily get to it with a big tanker, and they can take that sediment away every maybe 2 or 3 years. It's a solution. There are reasons why it's not an ideal solution, but nonetheless, it is an effective solution. This is a Vortex grit separator, which is a subsurface device that you buy. It comes on site ready to go, plug and play. Excellent workhorse for stormwater treatment. It causes the runoff to go into a vortex, a bit like your Dyson cleaner. So the sediment settles out at the bottom and the water passes forward to a pond or a basin or whatever. And it takes out probably 50 to 60% of the gross pollution in the runoff. It's an excellent opportunity to capture the worst of the pollution. Equally, an oil water separator does pretty much the same thing, but in a slightly different way. This is bigger, so it just allows the water to rest so the sediment settles out. And again, it's easy to get to with a vacuum tanker, and you take that sediment away and you've removed it from the water environment. Filter drains are lovely. I love filter drains. These are good for roads because they're a linear device. In fact, I've got another slide in a second. Just let me put this slide up first. The reason they're so good is that because it's a linear device, you've got a huge treatment capacity. So if you put a Vortex separator at the end of a pipe run, you might have 30 cubic meters of treatment capacity. But if you put a filter drain along a roadside, you will have hundreds of cubic meters of treatment capacity, just because you've got that length of filter drain down the whole side of the road. So they're an excellent option, particularly on new roads. There's no excuse not to include them, but they can be an excellent option for retrofit as well. Just to go back to how they function, the sediment is captured in the stone layer. So in the spaces between the stones, you might have a metre depth of stones. The sediment is captured in there. And then under that stone layer, you can have a layer of treatment media. In this example, it's a product called SDS Aqua Exchange, but there are others on the market, and that captures the dissolved pollutants as well. So within that filter drain, you're taking out the sediments, you're taking out the dissolved pollution, you're attenuating the flow, so you're delivering flood risk, and you are creating a safe device at the side of the carriageway. So they're an excellent solution for roads. Stormwater filters, when we move on to looking at dissolved pollutants, which I talked about earlier, stormwater filters are a good option. We don't use them very often in the UK because it's unusual to need to capture the dissolved pollutants as well. Interestingly, I think the only example I'm aware of these being installed, particularly for water quality protection, is a school in Wales, a secondary school, where they installed one of these filters to capture dissolved pollutants before they went into the stream, because the stream was very, very vulnerable. But they certainly exist. There are these ones which are downflow filters, and these ones which are upflow filters, and they capture the dissolved pollutants. So they are available on the UK market. But saying that, another way of capturing your dissolved pollutants is in vegetative devices. So ponds, basins, wetlands, swales, bioremediation zones, tree pits, all these vegetative devices, which I'll show you in a moment, they capture some of those dissolved pollutants too. And obviously they also deliver all those lovely benefits. So habitats for wildlife, green spaces in city centres, nice places for people to spend time. So the vegetative devices are often preferred because of the multiple benefits they deliver. So I would argue for busy roads and trunk roads, you need a manufactured device first and then a vegetative device. And for less busy roads, you can just go straight into a vegetative device, which will deal with all your pollution concerns. So can retrofit SUDs in urban areas help? Yes, they're brilliant. And we've got masses of examples across the UK where retrofit SUDs have been included as part of street improvements or roadworks or junction improvements. And local authorities have taken that opportunity to retrofit some SUDs in there to capture the runoff, to reduce flood risk locally, to improve the aesthetics of the area, or to reduce water pollution, or to do all of those things. So there's lots of examples. I'll show you a few in a moment. It's very interesting because some local authorities do lots of this, some local authorities do less of this. But I think as Schedule 3 unfolds in England, and obviously Schedule 3 embeds more firmly in Wales, we'll start to see more and more retrofit SUDs. They reduce storm overflow discharges and they reduce pollution, and they can be really beautiful. So this is the famous one, Green Grangetown in Cardiff, that I imagine you're probably all aware of. The glorious thing about Green Grangetown was the partnership working. So Cardiff Council, Natural Resources Wales and Welsh Water all worked together, and the funding was delivered by those partners. But also there was this inclusion of the local community. So these four gentlemen who I encountered when I went to take some photographs were all delighted to sit and chat about the SUDs for a while. And actually interesting, two of them had moved down to Cardiff from Lancashire because they were so pleased with Cardiff and they enjoyed living there so much. So that made me feel, I come from Lancashire, so I was a bit wounded. But an excellent scheme because it was done in partnership with partners funded it, but also done in partnership with the local community. This photograph I took not long after it had been constructed, and it's a useful photograph for me because it shows how the device functions. But actually they take time to settle in, they take time to mature. And this was towards the end of the following summer, and then they start to look beautiful. So don't be alarmed if they look a bit grimy at the beginning, because you've obviously, just like if you plant your own flower bed at home, when you first put the plants in, they look a bit sad, but they soon take time to look glorious like that. And it's at that point that device provides a habitat for insects, a cool, damp environment for species to live in the hot, dry summers that we're going to have more of. It's pollinator species. It's just a beautiful device. And these are a few examples that lovely Ian Titherington sent me this week from Cardiff, because I said I was giving this presentation and I wanted some examples. Again, newly planted, so not quite looking as gorgeous as they will, but they will look gorgeous when they're finished. This is, I think, Cathay's Terrace, and then this one is Park Place, and this is a basin, so this will be magnificent. This will be a wetted environment for amphibious species and insects to live in once it gets going and all the plants have got going. And this is Wood Street, just tree pits. I think tree pits are very smart for commercial areas like this. They do exactly the same thing, but most of the action happens underground. And these will all be maintained by the principal contractor for 5 years to make sure that they work, and then they'll be taken over by the adopting authority, which will be Cardiff City Council in this instance. And this is just a London example, which is really nice. Camley Street Gardens, the whole street had retrofit bioremediation zones. And Alistair Bayford kindly took some photographs in the summer when the flowers had got going, and it just looks beautiful. Then I took these photographs recently. This is just to show how good they are for wildlife. So lots of species enjoying the SUDs at Buckshaw Village in the sunshine, but also the children feed the ducks. So everybody enjoys these SUDs, and they're maintained by a maintenance contractor, and they just look gorgeous. So do we do this? Yes, we do this. We do this as soon as we can, and we do as much of it as we can. They make a huge difference. It can be a small additional cost if you piggyback on an existing scheme. And so there's no reason or excuse not to do more retrofit SUDs as fast as we can. Thank you, Pete. Sorry, I ran over a little bit, but I hope we've got time for questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Jo. I wonder if you could make me the host again, and then I'll try and ringmaster the questions.
Yep, there you go.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. Like I say, I learned more in that hour's conversation with you than I had done in the previous 30 years. And this is only added to my knowledge. Brilliant. Fantastic. I wonder if I could ask Laura Cotton to unmute her microphone and video and to ask the question that you posted in the chat. Laura.
Oh yeah, video on. Videos. Oh, it's coming. Yeah, hi. I just wondered, like, when the swales and vegetative areas look quite bare in winter, are they still effective in compared to their kind of summer state?
Their summer glory. Yes, they are,
yes.
Laura. So a lot of the activity happens in the soil horizons, and so the soils in those zones are carefully engineered soils. They're not just the sort of topsoil you and I would use in our gardens. And so most of the activity happens in there. So that will go on through the winter. You may lose some of the nutrient uptake because your plants aren't growing, but the nutrients generally will be captured in the soils ready for the plants to grow in the spring. But your suspended solids will still be captured because they're captured at surface. Any toxic metals or polyaromatic hydrocarbons will still be stuck to the surfaces within the soil horizons. And the best thing in the winter is that you get the flood alleviation. So you get the attenuation of water, so your flood benefits are delivered. So the benefits do change season to season. So those gentlemen who you saw sitting at Greener Grangetown wouldn't be sitting there if it was snowing or pouring with rain. So things will change. People will enjoy them in the summer. The insects will enjoy them in the summer. They deliver flood risk management in the winter, and they deliver habitats for damp habitats for wildlife in the depths of summer when it's really hot and dry. So things change a bit, but they're always delivering.
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Joe, it was amazing to see just how awful motorways and trunk roads are, and particularly big junctions. So it strikes me that if I've got it right, those are the areas that we need to be concentrating on with things like the Vortex separators and the big pre-manufactured components. And then
that's right.
And then going more to the sort of things that we see in Grangetown and the other photographs that you showed us. I know there are companies out there that are trying very hard to sell a lot of manufactured components for SUDs in urban areas. Are they essential for those smaller schemes?
Depends on your suspended solids yield. So if you're expecting lots of suspended solids like a motorway or a busy junction, then it is important to capture some of those suspended solids and that pollution before it goes on into your pond or basin or bioremediation zone, because otherwise you're just creating a vegetative habitat and then polluting it, which is unethical at best and immoral at worst. So certainly consider your surface, and if you need to have a pre-treatment, then install it. But for most towns and cities, you can go straight into your SUDs, straight into your tree pit, straight into your bioremediation zone, and that will be perfectly acceptable because the pollution load isn't all that high. And for some places, pedestrian areas, primary school car parks, places where your pollution load is particularly low, then your SUDS habitats will genuinely become fantastic habitats for wildlife, as well as delivering all the benefits. So it's horses for courses, really. And I get a lot of pushback from the manufacturers when I talk about devices that are not manufactured, the vegetative devices, but that certainly should always be the preferred choice where they're viable.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We've got a question from Sarah Bennett. I wonder, Sarah, could you unmute your microphone and turn your camera on if you'd like, and ask Joe the question you just posted in the chat?
Hi. Yeah, so I haven't really looked at this. I've just noticed that in the environmental permitting regulations that there is something about highway drains in there. So I was just wondering whether you've ever come across a scenario where someone has been required to have a permit to discharge.
Sarah, my life's work has been to try and persuade government to enforce that clause of the environmental permitting regulations.
Okay.
I'm not aware of a single permit. I think there may be one or two knocking about, but bearing in mind there's estimated to be 1 million outfalls, I promise you that there are not 1 million permits. The legislation says they are allowed to discharge their highway drainage into the water environment as long as it doesn't cause pollution. I would argue that every highway outfall now causes pollution. Perhaps 40, 50 years ago they didn't, but now they do. They should then have notice served upon them by the regulator to apply for a permit. And that permit should dictate the level of treatment that they need to install and the maintenance requirements for that treatment. That is what I would love to see. I'd love to see every motorway outfall and every trunk road outfall have a notice served upon it by the regulator, and then the highway authority to apply for a permit, and then the permit to say this outfall must have a vortex grit separator and a pond, or it must fully treat the first 27 millimeters of rainfall, or have something explicit in it that describes the treatment they should have and then how they should maintain it. I cannot get any traction.
I should say that I do actually work for NRW, so I am a regulator.
Yeah.
So I can, it just needs to be, if it's going to happen, it's got to be a project, hasn't it, that's driven by, yeah.
Yes, and actually, well, I wonder if we'd get more traction in, I don't know whether we'd get more traction in Wales. Certainly in England, when I worked at the Environment Agency, they just wouldn't let me do it. I tried really, really hard. And since I've left the Environment Agency, I've groaned and moaned and written articles and taken part in committees and all sorts to try and make it happen. But there is no political appetite for it at all.
Okay.
But yeah, if you think you could, NRW working with Welsh Government could perhaps try a couple, it'd be brilliant. To be fair, your motorway, the M4 going through the south of Wales, has actually got some really good treatment devices on it because it was built it's fairly new in the motorway world. So it would be great to do some research on those treatment devices and see what benefit they're delivering, and to see if they're being maintained. I've no idea. But as you drive along there, you'll notice, now we've had this chat, you'll notice there are lots of little signs saying pollution control device and little steps and gates, and that takes you down to ponds and basins and things. So,
okay. Thank you. Thanks, Joe.
And Baria, you've posted the question. Could you unmute yourself and turn on your video and pose the question to Joe?
Sorry. Sorry about the name. It's come up as I just installed Zoom, so it's come up as my automatic email name. So my name's Adam, working for Caerphilly County Borough Council. So previously we'd done a design on a trunk road, and looking through the drainage design standards, pretty much filter drains are unfavoured now for reasons outside of environmental. I think I mentioned on there about the main reason is an issue with stone scatter. And I think it's a maintenance issue. So I think going on to this now, are you likely, well, basically under the DMRB design standards, are we likely to be reversing that and now reincorporating filter drainage and highway drainage? Because at the moment, as I said, the favoured options are what you've shown as the concrete surface water channels or grass channels, which can't be used in, especially the grass ones do provide some pollution control. The DMRB run a very basic kind of tabulated system of saying what's acceptable for pollution control. But yeah, what's your interface with the DMRB, and are you going to be able to reverse that? Because obviously people are doing tenders and things like that off of this design guidance. If people start running in filter drains on these tenders and design proposals, then they're probably going to be excluded quite quickly for maintenance probably reasons, really. So yeah, what sort of impact can you have on those design standards from this?
There are some filter drains on the motorway network. You have to be brave, Adam. So you have to. Caerphilly Council could be the trailblazer here and have your own guidance saying that you accept filter drains. That would be brilliant. There are some on the motorway network. It requires the designer to do a departure from standard through national highways or through yourselves. And we have seen some departures for filter drains. The stone scatter risk we've pretty much overcome. Highways England have accepted, or National Highways have accepted, that the stone scatter risk is outweighed by the benefit of the filter drains. And certainly by selecting the right type of stone, there seems to be evidence that you can reduce that. Be careful with DMRB because that talks about grass filter drains with a grass surface on the top, which won't work. So just overlook that bit, because putting grass on the top completely negates the ability of the filter drain to capture the sediment. So Don't do that. The trick is to look at Scotland, where they have filter drains everywhere. It's certainly their preferred technique for drainage management, and they've used them for years. I mean, probably 50 plus years, and they don't have a problem with them. And they have the equipment to do LiDAR surveys to see when they're blocked, and then they have the equipment to take the stone out, wash it and put it back in again overnight. So maintenance can be relatively straightforward. So I disagree with DMRB. I disagree with huge parts of DMRB. I want DMRB to include a treatment flow rate, and it doesn't. So it should say that all highway treatment schemes should treat at least 27 millimetres of rainfall, if not 40 millimetres of rainfall, but it doesn't. So designers often come to me and say, well, we're going to treat the first 10 millimetres of rainfall. Well, that's pointless. You might as well not bother, because you need to treat a whole lot more than the first 10 millimetres, because it will carry on being polluted probably up to 40 millimetres and beyond. So there are problems with DMRB. For your purposes, for your local environment, pollution prevention is incredibly important because of where you are. So, you know, think hard about what you prefer. Those concrete slip form drainage channels do not protect the environment. And even with a vortex separator and a pond at the end of that drainage run, you can't deliver environment protection effectively, because you can't treat the flow rates. You might get 1,000 litres per second coming down one of those concrete slip form channels, and nobody can treat 1,000 litres per second properly with an end of pipe treatment system. So filter drains should be the preferred option. But I'm not.
They are a very good drainage option. It's just pretty much DMRB kind of. They kind of drew the line under them due to the stone scatter issue. So it's one of those. They actually a really good drainage option, especially when it comes to steep gradients and things like that.
You've got the freedom to make those rules for yourself, because DMRB is just guidance. So, you know, if you include that in your design specification that you want somebody to tender for a filter drain installation, then go for it.
Right.
I'm right behind you. Give me a shout if you need me to come in.